Hi, everyone. Welcome in. We'll get started in just a minute. In the meantime, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat, give us your name, your role, and what organization you're working for. And if you're feeling up to it, try to find an emoji that describes something fun you did this weekend. Hello, hello. Noah, how's it looking? Does it look like people are slowing down?
We still have people slow rolling in here, so maybe another minute or two.
Sounds good. Well, I might um just go ahead and start with some intro to churn stuff, and then we can get started in a couple minutes with Jennifer. So thanks everyone for tuning in today. Please keep introducing yourself in the chat. Um, Let us know, yeah, your name, your role in your organization, and if you want to use an emoji to describe something fun that you did this weekend, we'd love to hear about it. My name is Chandler Countryman. I am with Washington Sea Grant and I help co-coordinate the Coastal Hazards Resilience Network. One of our other co-coordinators, Noah Link, is also on today, and we'll be helping keeping up with stuff in the chat and some questions and everything. So, uh, for any new folks today, the Coastal Hazards Resilience Network, or what we call CHRN, is co-managed by the Washington State Department of Ecology, Washington Sea Grant, and our newest partner, Washington Emergency Management Division. CHRN seeks to strengthen the resilience of Washington's coastal communities through collaboration, education, and knowledge exchange. We do have a website that provides a curated selection of relevant science, best practices, and other resources related to coastal hazards in Washington. It guides you in the process of learning about coastal hazards. It directs you to Washington-specific tools and resources, and it provides you examples of projects that are happening along our coast and connects you with people who are involved in the work. And as part of this knowledge exchange portion of our mission, we host an annual meeting to bring together coastal practitioners. And in recent years, we have started to offer these lunch and learns as a response to network member requests for more frequent opportunities for knowledge exchange and connections throughout the year. We also do host a listserv where we share announcements for things like the Lunch and Learn and also share a monthly newsletter that we co-manage with Oregon Sea Grant and Cascadia Copes Hub that has a curated selection of current and upcoming opportunities like webinars, funding announcements, open jobs, and a lot more. So make sure you sign up for that listserv if you don't want to miss any of those announcements. And I believe Noah is sharing all of those links in the chat. We do also hold virtual drop-in office hours immediately following each of our lunch and learns. So for anyone interested in that, you can simply use the same link that you're in right now to pop in right after this lunch and learn starting at noon. Noah and I will be there if you want to ask any questions, update us on what you're working on, or just say hi. And we will also have someone from the Interagency Coastal Hazards Organizational Resilience team there if you want to connect with that team at all or cohort. Just a bit of an overview on what you can expect from today's Lunch and Learn. Our Lunch and Learns are meant to be a two-way conversation. So we're going to start with a presentation, which we will record, and then we'll switch to some open discussion, which will not be recorded. You can feel free to use reactions and emojis to show support or help with some of the virtual interaction throughout this event. And you can also add your questions or comments in the chat during the presentation, and then during the open discussion portion, you are welcome to raise your Zoom hand and come off mute to ask questions or share anything that way. And Noah is here to help facilitate that portion of today's event. Which brings me to introduce today's speaker. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, who will be facilitating a discussion today on the emotional dimensions of climate change and ecological loss. Jennifer is a professor of environmental humanities at the University of Washington Bothell and is co-author of the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. She holds a master's and a PhD in English Lit from the University of Chicago and got her bachelor's in English and History from UC Santa Barbara. Her work related to eco grief and climate anxiety has been featured in things like the New York Times, NPR, National Geographic, and many, many others. And I know a lot of you in the audience today are working on really challenging components of coastal and climate resilience with a lot of different coastal communities. So it's our hope today that connecting with Jennifer can help you give some insight and tools to help you in your roles with that work. So Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time today to share with us, and I'm going to pass it to you to begin your presentation.
Thanks so much, Chandler. And thanks to all of you for letting me join during your lunch hour today. The first thing that I wanted to say, and this should be evident, I think, from that introduction, is that I am not an environmental scientist. I'm not a policy person, and I am not a psychologist or a mental health professional. My field is environmental humanities, which focuses on how we represent and engage with the natural world through literature and philosophy and the arts. And as Chandler mentioned, my PhD actually is in literature. And for the past decade, I've taught courses on climate change, climate fiction, the arts, et cetera, that really focus on the ethical and existential dimensions of this issue. But it's actually that humanities approach that got me into this work of addressing climate despair. And I think that's because most of the learning and conversations that our students at University of Washington are having around climate change, those conversations are still primarily happening in science classes where planetary destruction is represented using statistics and graphs and numerical equations. And by and large, they don't make a space for students to really grieve the losses that we're living through or ask them how they feel about the material, right? But I'm sure everyone here knows that we are all carrying around a deep and often unconscious grief that comes from living in an era where so much life and beauty are being destroyed. And in fact, my students often tell me they can't sleep at night or they want to drop out of their major because the material is so heavy. And I'm going to share my screen here to show some quotes from my students and some other material that I wanted to share during my talk. Okay. So this slide shows quotes that are really typical from this group. I always ask on the very first day of my class, how do you feel about the future? You know, they're saying they feel hopeless, useless, minuscule. Why even bother bringing children into an already dying world? And you know, this goes on and on. It's the same almost every year. In fact, getting progressively worse, I would say. There are many reasons, of course, this is a problem. It's not just that young people are suffering, and of course we don't want that. But from a practical standpoint, and I'm looking at this as an educator, the research shows that fear, despair, and chronic anxiety are a huge impediment to creative thinking and problem solving, even though those are exactly the skills that we need for climate solutions. So that's how I got into this work. Just acknowledging that historically there has been much more focus on the physical damage of climate change, even though it's profoundly impacting our internal landscapes as well. So the short version of my bio is it was about 6 or 7 years ago, after seeing so many of my students spiral in despair and actually feeling an immense amount of grief and anxiety myself. I threw together a kind of an emergency seminar that would at least provide a space for students and faculty to openly talk about their emotional responses and support each other. And even though I didn't have any formal training in mental health, as I mentioned, I really think that the humanities offer some very powerful tools and language to explore the existential questions that people are grappling with in this age of climate breakdown, the kinds of questions that you see on this slide. All of that said, I do want to confess that in this moment, and by this moment, I mean since mid-January, I have just felt massively unqualified to deal with this topic. I mean, you know, what can any of us say to folks who have lost their jobs or their funding or maybe their entire professional future? I think like so many others, I just feel like we are in truly uncharted territory now. So I kind of hesitated when I was asked to come here today, knowing that many of you have probably more lived experience with navigating climate despair in this moment, even than I do. But I think what might be more helpful than anything that I can say is just this opportunity for all of us to be together during this hour and share what we're feeling, how we're coping, any resources or strategies that might be of aid in this moment that, we can at least be present and listen to each other. So I'll start. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes or so sharing some insights and resources around climate-related distress that have been helpful, at least to my own students. And then we can open the discussion and I think maybe crowdsource some additional strategies that other folks bring to the conversation. So just to give a quick snapshot, I'm sure none of this is surprising to anybody here, but this is like giving an idea of where young people are right now emotionally. It's about 3 or 4 years ago, The Lancet published the largest research study ever done on mental health impacts of climate. And the responses were from 10,000 teens from across the world. So Brazil, the Philippines, Finland, Nigeria, US, India, Australia. 56% of youth said they believed humanity is doomed. 1 in 4 are afraid to have children. 45% said that climate anxiety was disrupting daily activities like sleeping or focusing on schoolwork. And 77% characterized our climate future as frightening. So our failure to act on climate is not just robbing young people of ecological stability, but also their joy and their well-being. And insofar as climate inaction is foreclosing on young people's hope in their own future, it constitutes a moral injury, which is the specific language that these authors use. What I found most important in this report is that young people said they could actually deal with the physical impacts of climate change. But what made it feel intolerable was the sense of betrayal and inaction on the part of governments and a whole generation of grown-ups, the very people who are supposed to protect kids. And so for me, this felt like the most important insight or the big headline to come out of that Lancet study. The fact that young people are deeply distressed in itself isn't surprising, but this seems like the real takeaway that for young people, mental anguish around climate change doesn't come from temperature increase so much as feeling abandoned and betrayed. So the question is, how can we better support them, but also support ourselves in navigating this emotional toll and really addressing this head on? This is the checklist I use with my own students for building existential tenacity. It is far from perfect. It is not comprehensive. And in fact, my students and I add in and swap out different elements all the time. But at least in the most recent conversation we had, these were the steps we focused on. And again, this changes. I really do hope many of you add more to the list during our discussion. But the first is simply acknowledging and making space to talk about climate's emotional toll. I was thinking of a recent poll from NPR that showed that 85% of parents across the political spectrum thought that children should be learning about climate change, but only half of those parents said that they talked to their own kids about it. And this is more pernicious than we might think because silence around environmental issues communicates its own implicit message, like fatalism and indifference. And then in addition to that, a huge part of people's depression and anxiety around climate actually comes from feeling alone and isolated. So in surveys of my students, they often say no one else is as scared or distressed as they are. And that perception makes people feel either deviant or like everyone else around them is indifferent to the end of the world. But when we openly and outwardly acknowledge those emotional responses, we very quickly find how widespread these feelings are, which counteracts isolation and creates a sense of solidarity. And in fact, when I resurveyed my students at the end of the quarter, like every year I do this, they say over and over again, the single most helpful thing about my seminar was just being in the room with other people talking about the same struggles. and being heard when they voice their own distress. It wasn't anything I taught them. It wasn't any reading I assigned. It was being there with each other and recognizing the pervasiveness of this issue. Then the second tool involves reframing, where we recognize a perceived deficit as something that may actually be empowering. Grief, anger, sadness, these are healthy and appropriate responses to climate destruction and biodiversity loss and the unprecedented harm to life on our planet and to communities around us. It's true that we don't want those emotions to hijack us and derail our mental health, but at the same time, we need to recognize that they are an expression of empathy and a way of honoring our connection with other beings. And in fact, I tell my students to see eco-anxiety as a moral emotion. It's a sign of attachment to a livable world. It emerges from compassion and a desire for justice. And the same is true with grief. Unfortunately, because it's painful, many people think of grief, particularly here in the West and in the United States. We see grief as a sign that something is wrong with us and that needs to be fixed. But if grief arises from love and attachment, then our pain is proportional to that love. It is the price we pay for connection. But I think that's crucial to remember in an age when the lack of compassion and love for other beings and for forests and rivers and wildlife is precisely what has allowed us to harm them and treat them merely as resources in the first place. When we grieve, we remember that our existence and well-being are deeply entwined with other lives and other species. And Malkia Devich-Cyril has one of the best quotes on this, where she says, "Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference." And I don't think that the environmental movement has always been good at honoring this, precisely because our messaging around climate change is so rooted in urgency, which is completely understandable given our timeline, and I feel it myself. But that often sends a message that we don't have time to dwell on our feelings, and so we rush past those emotional responses and jump straight into action. But when we skip that in-between step of processing the emotional toll of all of this lost beauty and life, we are bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. So with my students, I really try to make this explicit that grief is not here to take us hostage. It's a kind of compass that really points us directly back to what we cherish most. And from that perspective, I hope we can all embrace these dark emotions, these moral emotions, and see them as our allies. And then, if all of that is just too lyrical for you, and you prefer a perspective that's more concrete, there's also data showing that people with high levels of eco-anxiety and eco-grief do engage in pro-environmental behaviors more frequently and are more focused on finding solutions. Then the next step on the checklist is to gently question all or nothing thinking about climate change, which is so prevalent and tempting in a conversation that is defined by the rhetoric of deadlines, tipping points, 1.5 or 2 degree threshold. This has fed a huge uptick in doomism in recent years. Of course, it's not entirely responsible, but it does amplify that in many ways. And going back to that study of 10,000 teens across the globe that was published in The Lancet, more than half, again, said they believe that humanity is doomed. The research shows that that belief is profoundly demotivating and actually makes people withdraw from seeking action. And again, we all understand where this comes from. In fact, I think for young people, that stance can almost feel like an affirmation of how seriously they're taking the problem, or even like an ethical repudiation of the previous generation and its culture of minimizing or denying climate change, which is what got us to this point. The problem is thinking of denial and doom as opposites is itself a kind of false binary. Because if denial is dismissing or turning away from the problem, right, it's not real or it's not that bad. And doom is the stance that it's all too real. And in fact, now it's so bad that it's too late. While those might start from different points, they end up really converging in the same place, which is a psychology of helplessness and inaction. Or as Rebecca Solnit puts it in her new book, Not Too Late, she says, if you don't believe there's a fire, or if you don't believe the fire can be put out, you don't join the firefighters. So I like to share with my students the way psychologist Leslie Davenport frames climate denial and doom, both as basic psychic defenses against the enormity of the problem and human discomfort with uncertainty and ambiguity. So she explains that we don't like to be in an in-between state where we're unsure what's going to happen. And so while that sometimes leads to disavowal and turning away, other people go towards doom, right? It's too late to act. And Davenport says, quote, paradoxically, moving to either one of those places provides a kind of psychological relief because one, it excuses us from acting. And two, it gets us out of that uncomfortable gray zone where we're suspended between multiple possible outcomes. We don't know how the story's going to end, and we have to live with that ambivalence, right? At least with doom, you know what to expect. The climate era requires all of us to get more comfortable with uncertainty as we face the path ahead. I don't think anybody in the last 20 years has been quoted more on radical uncertainty than Rebecca Solnit. And I didn't even choose this quote. Every quarter, I asked my students to share the passages that spoke most powerfully to them. And I think this is the one that gets picked more than any other quote, where she writes, hope locates itself in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. And the last couple here, rewrite the story is number 4. I think this is really precisely where that power of storytelling and imagination come in, because if what comes next is unknown, we have the opportunity to help write that chapter ourselves. But of course, we first need to move away from the conventional rhetoric of catastrophe, which has dominated climate storytelling for a generation, whether those stories are told in the news or fiction or Hollywood movies, or even in our classrooms. Of course, it's really hard to imagine a climate changed future in which we're thriving if we never see anything like that depicted. And second, it's terrible for our mental health. When I'm giving talks to younger audiences, I usually talk a lot more about social media and doom scrolling. I think they get this, that they know that media profits from feeding us a constant stream of catastrophe, but it does help when I remind them, and also when I remind myself, whenever we get sucked into a doom scrolling loop, be aware that your response was engineered by media and tech companies to hook you. And more importantly, your body and psyche are paying a price for exposure to the nonstop stress of 24/7 media feeds, just bombarding us with alarming information. Our mental and our physical systems just are not designed to handle that kind of chronic stress. At the same time, of course, no reasonable person would advocate that we bury our heads in the sand right now, especially with all of the sabotage happening around us. But what I ask is that we remember that those bad news stories are just one version of reality. And whenever we see news of catastrophe, we should always ask ourselves, what else is real? Because solutions and change and calls for transformation are also happening. You'd never know it from the mainstream media, but just because they're underreporting those solution-based stories doesn't mean they're any less real. And frankly, we owe it to the people doing the good work to give their efforts as much attention as we give the news of breakdown. And by good work, I mean probably much of what everybody on this call is investing their daily efforts in. It does take effort to seek out those stories because our media is set up so you have to proactively set out positive news. And I myself subscribe to groups that aggregate solution-based stories. The Daily Climate gives a daily report on positive developments around the world. I'm sure many of you are likely familiar with Project Drawdown. But all of this actually isn't the material I really wanted to share under this point about rewriting the story, because I think the most important stories aren't even the ones that are being told in the media. They're the stories that we tell ourselves. And this is where I like to share a study from Maria Oyala, who is a leading researcher on climate education and environmental psychology. She's worked with kids studying different strategies for how they cope with climate-related anxiety. So the first is problem-focused coping, where you seek to address what's causing the problem. The second is emotional coping, where you can't control the problem, so you seek to instead manage your painful feelings. And the third is meaning-focused coping, which finds positive values in confronting challenges. And she found that the first two approaches had significant limitations for coping with climate change. Where Oyala found young people exhibiting the highest resilience was in that group that adopted meaning-focused coping strategies, which involve reframing a problem to find a sense of purpose in the struggle to address it. And this is especially important for problems that can't be solved in the short term and require ongoing engagement, like climate change. So young people who used meaning-focused coping situated their efforts in a much larger story of social transformation. And not surprisingly, they were much better able to engage contradiction as well. So acknowledging, yes, the situation is grim, but I choose to find purpose by rising up to meet the greatest challenge of our time. Or asking themselves, how could this crisis be an opportunity to dismantle structures of injustice? And what role can I play, or can my generation play, in responding to climate upheaval with compassion and with courage? And then the final two steps on my list are about connecting with others to build community and taking action. And I usually spend a lot more time on these last 2 points, but with folks like all of you who already work in environmental spaces, I think this is a message that you've long since internalized and acted upon. If you do want to share resources with folks that you work with, or maybe who really need to seek out others who share their concerns, my website is in that yellow box. And if you go to the resources page there, I list a number of discussion groups that focus specifically on climate anxiety. And these are both held virtually and in person. You'll see listed there the Good Grief Network, which has been doing this work for probably 14 years or so. They're fantastic, very, very well established. And the Climate Courage Workshop is another one that's great. It's very international. For all of these options, the groups both give, well, they facilitate them themselves, but others will provide templates and instructions for people who want to facilitate their own discussions if a community doesn't already have something in place. And another step that I tell people is climate cafes are another great resource. And all you have to do is just Google climate cafe and then enter your city, and it usually will give you something nearby. But again, you can start your own if nothing currently exists. And then really that connection itself is meant to lead to step number 6, to get engaged and take action. And I don't have the slides on this and I don't have the research handy, but in a lot of my talks, I do look at some really compelling recent research on, we hear this mantra over and over that the best therapy is to take action. And I do believe in that, but I think we need to be mindful about what kind of action we're prescribing, because the research has actually shown that people that take individual actions like just recycling or using public transportation, all of that's great, very important. We want to do that. But if you're doing it to alleviate your anxiety, it actually does not. It doesn't help with that mental health component. It's collective action and being part of a group that actually helps with the mental health piece. So it's one more, I think, really powerful incentive to prescribe to people to take collective action, because that is the best medicine actually for addressing these mental health and issues of despair. So that's where I'm going to wrap up. I have my Instagram on here, Jennifer W. Atkinson, and I do try to post resources from time to time there, or upcoming talks, or just other workshops and resources I come across that are really helpful for this particular issue, if you want to follow that. And then my website has many of the resources, including some activities and workshops and readings, if you want to check that out. And then our book really is meant for educators, but is, I think, helpful for anybody who is facilitating conversations. There are a number of activities in there and guides to give people different approaches towards successfully facilitating these conversations around the mental health issues of climate. So with that, I wanted to stop, and I'll stop sharing my screen here so we can all see each other. Did I get that to stop? Here we go. And I'm curious if others might have their own kind of resources or strategies, or have been thinking about this issue in other terms, just want to share anything about how they're feeling in this moment, or ways that we can kind of crowdsource strategies and tools to help ourselves maintain that kind of resilience through these really difficult times.